My younger brother broke into my condo while I was recovering from surgery, used the property management card I'd been entrusted with, and charged over $11,000 to an account that wasn't mine to spend. My aunt told everyone he was just stressed. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the account he'd emptied belonged to our late father's estate, and by touching it, he'd just signed away his entire share of the inheritance. I'd had the laparoscopic procedure on a Tuesday. Nothing life-threatening, just enough to knock me flat for a week, groggy from the anesthesia, moving slowly, eating soup I'd frozen in advance because I knew myself well enough to plan for uselessness. I was a property manager for a mid-sized residential portfolio in Hamilton, Ontario, meticulous by training, cautious by nature. I kept files the way other people keep friendships, carefully and for the long haul. The card was not mine in the casual sense. It was linked to the estate account my father had set up before he died, a trust-adjacent structure managed through a notarized executor agreement I'd been appointed to oversee 18 months earlier. Dad had been a civil engineer, methodical and unsentimental about money. He'd watched my brother spend his way through 2 cars and a failed landscaping business by age 24, and he'd quietly made arrangements. He didn't tell my brother what those arrangements were, he told me. The card lived in a fireproof lockbox in my home office closet. It was not in my wallet. It was not on my dresser. I want to be clear about that, because what my brother did required actual effort. The first alert came at 11:47 on a Thursday night, while I was half asleep on the couch with a heating pad across my abdomen. My phone buzzed from the coffee table. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again and again, a rapid string of notifications that pulled me out of the fog I'd been living in for 4 days. I picked it up. Transaction alert, $2,340. Best Buy Erin Mills Town Center. Transaction alert, $1,890 Sensory, Sporting Life, Yorkdale. Transaction alert, $880, Apple Store, Square One. Transaction alert, Indochino, custom order, Indochino, custom order, $1,050. Indochino. I sat up too fast and felt the pull of the incision. My hands were shaking by the time I opened the banking app. The balance, which should have been just over $210,000, was showing $197,400 and change, nearly $13,000 gone. I stared at the screen long enough for the numbers to stop making sense. Then I made myself breathe, made myself think. I got up slowly and walked to my office. The closet door was closed, which meant nothing. I always closed it. But the lockbox was sitting on the shelf at a slightly wrong angle, tilted a few degrees forward. I hadn't left it that way. I'm not the kind of person who leaves things at slightly wrong angles. The box was locked, that the card was gone. My brother had a key to my condo. I'd given it to him 8 months earlier when I'd traveled to Vancouver for a conference and needed someone to water my plants and collect my mail. I'd asked for it back. He'd said he'd bring it next time. Next time kept not happening, and I kept not pressing it, which I suppose is its own kind of answer about the dynamic we'd had for most of our adult lives. I sat down on the edge of my office chair and thought very carefully about what to do next. I didn't call him. I didn't call my aunt. I called the fraud line for the bank, reported the card stolen, and had it frozen. Then I sat in the quiet of my apartment. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of rain against the window, and I opened my laptop. My father's executor documents were in a folder I'd labelled with his initials and the year he'd died. I read through Section 7 again, the clause he'd insisted on including, the one the family solicitor had read aloud at the estate meeting, and that both my brother and my aunt had signed a form acknowledging. I'd been present for that meeting. I'd watched my brother skim the pages, his leg bouncing with impatience. I'd watched my aunt nod along with the serene confidence of someone who believes rules are for other people. Section 7 was not ambiguous. Any withdrawal from the estate account made without written executor approval, for purposes other than verified estate expenses or the specific disbursement schedule outlined in Schedule B, would constitute a breach of the executor agreement and trigger the forfeiture provision in the underlying will. The beneficiary, my brother, would lose his entitlement to the estate's residual assets, not the 9,000, not a portion. All of it. Dad had made me read it twice before he died. His exact words, sitting up in the hospital bed with the oxygen monitor clipped to his finger. He won't believe it's real until it's too late. That's all right. Make sure you do your job. I closed the laptop. I made a cup of tea I didn't drink. Then I called Mr. O.C. Bonsu, the family solicitor who'd handled my father's estate, and left a voicemail at midnight, my voice steadier than I expected. He called back at 7:15 the next morning. "I've been waiting for something like this," he said, not unkindly, not hoping for it, but waiting. "He spent just under 13,000, I said. Electronics, clothing, I think a custom suit." There was a pause. "Is there any ambiguity about who made the transactions?" "He used his own phone to tap the card on the readers. The purchases are all in person. The stores will have footage." "Right." Another pause, longer this time. "You know what this triggers?" "I know." "He loses everything, the full residual, 200,000 give or take." "I know," I said again. "Your aunt will not take this quietly." "No," I agreed. "She won't." Mr. Osei Bonsu told me to rest, to stay off my feet, to let him handle the legal mechanics. He would file the notice of breach with the court, obtain the transaction records, and schedule a meeting with all relevant parties. He would contact my brother and my aunt directly. I didn't need to do anything yet. I hung up and lay back on the couch and stared at the ceiling for a long time. My aunt was not a bad person in the way that phrases usually meant. She wasn't cruel. She hadn't set out to raise my brother into someone who could steal from a recovering family member without apparent conflict. She just loved him in the way that certain people love the people they've decided are special. Completely, uncritically, and without any interest in what that kind of love costs everyone else. My brother was 11 years younger than me, a gap that had always functioned less like a birth order difference and more like an entire generation of lowered expectations. By the time he was in high school, our father had quietly stopped arguing with my aunt about how she handled him. By the time he was 20, my father was sick, and the energy required to hold the line had migrated elsewhere. My aunt moved in with us during Dad's illness. She was helpful in practical ways, driving him to appointments, managing the schedule, cooking. But she also, in that same period, began what I can only describe as a sustained lobbying campaign on my brother's behalf. He needed money for a truck for the landscaping business. He needed a co-signer for a lease on a commercial unit he never actually used. He needed someone to smooth things over with the client whose backyard he'd half finished before losing interest. My father said no to all of it. I said no to what landed at my door. My aunt said yes to as much as she could, and then came to us for the shortfall. The week after Dad's estate meeting, she pulled me aside in the kitchen and said with complete sincerity that she hoped I would be sensible about the account, that I would understand the trust Dad had placed in me was really meant to be shared with the family, that rigid adherence to legal documents was a cold way to honor a father's memory. I had been very polite. I had also that afternoon gone home and made a new folder on my laptop labeled Family Requests Denied and started keeping records. That folder had 18 months of material in it by the time my brother decided to take the shortcuts. The text from my aunt started the morning after I reported the card stolen. She didn't know I'd already called Mr. Osei Bonsu. As far as she was aware, this was still a family problem, which in her framework meant a problem to be smoothed over by the family. "Ellie, I know you found out about the card. I've spoken with him. He feels terrible. He was going to pay it back. Then he's been under so much pressure lately, you know how he gets. He's not a bad person. Then you have more than enough in that account. Dad would have wanted you to be flexible." I read each one and set my phone face down on the coffee table. There was nothing to say yet. The process had already started. My brother's message came that afternoon, a long, somewhat rambling text about how he just needed the money temporarily, how he had a deal coming through, how he'd actually thought that because the money was eventually going to be his, spending some of it early wasn't really stealing. It was more like borrowing against his own future. I thought about that framing for a while. I thought about how completely it illustrated the problem. The meeting Mr. Osei Bonsu scheduled was 2 weeks after the breach, on a Thursday morning at his office on King Street West. I'd been cleared to drive by then and was moving well enough, though I still tired quickly. I wore a blazer over a merino turtleneck and pulled my hair back. I brought a binder. The binder was something I put together over 3 days while I was supposed to be resting. I couldn't help it. Organization is the thing I reach for when everything else feels unstable. Inside, the executor agreement, tabbed at Section 7, the estate account statements with each unauthorized transaction highlighted, the transaction records Mr. Osei Bonsu had obtained from the bank, itemized, printouts of every request my aunt had made over the past 18 months, emails, texts, a few handwritten notes, with my formal denials attached, and a timeline showing that both she and my brother had been explicitly informed of the forfeiture clause and had signed the acknowledgement form. The acknowledgement form was the thing they seemed to have forgotten. My father had insisted on it over the solicitor's mild suggestion that it was unnecessary. "They'll say they didn't understand," Dad had said, matter-of-factly. "This way, they can't." I set my binder on Mr. Osei Bonsu's conference table and sat down on his right side. My aunt and brother were across from me. My aunt was wearing a blazer the color of a stop sign and had the expression of someone who had mentally prepared an argument. My brother looked younger than 25, always lit to my head. He was slouched, wearing a jacket I didn't recognize, and shoes I had a strong suspicion I'd seen in one of the transaction receipts. His arms were crossed, and he was looking at a point slightly above my left shoulder. Then he glanced at the binder spine. I'd printed a label for it. Estate Files, Section 7 Breach. He read it and looked away. Mr. Osei Bonsu opened the meeting with procedural calm, the same manner he'd had at the original estate meeting, measured and precise and completely unintimidated by my aunt's presence, which was a quality I appreciated more than I could easily express. He laid out the facts plainly. On the night in question, $12,830 had been withdrawn from the estate account via the designated debit card in a series of in-person transactions across 3 shopping centres in the Greater Toronto area. The beneficiary of the estate, my brother, had made these transactions using a card removed from the executor's secured storage without authorization. Thus not exactly how it happened, my aunt began. "I'd like to finish," Mr. Osei Bonsu said pleasantly. He continued, "The transactions did not qualify as approved estate expenses under Schedule B. They had not been authorized by the executor, me, in writing or verbally. This constituted a breach of the executor agreement. Under Section 7 of that agreement, as reinforced by the forfeiture clause in the underlying will, the beneficiary's entitlement to the residual estate assets was now void." My brother looked up for the first time. "Wait. Void meaning what?" "Meaning you no longer have a legal claim to the remaining estate assets." My brother started, then stopped. "How much is that?" "Approximately $198,000 after administrative costs." The silence in the room had texture to it. My aunt broke it first. "This is completely disproportionate," she said. Her voice was controlled, but her hands were not. She was gripping the edge of the table. "He made a mistake. One mistake. You cannot take away $200,000 because of one bad decision." "He was aware of the consequences," Mr. Osei Bonsu said. "Both of you were. You signed the acknowledgement form." "We signed it 2 years ago. We didn't think." "With respect," he said, "not thinking isn't the same as not knowing." "Ellie." My aunt turned to me, abandoning the solicitor's neutrality as a lost cause. "You cannot actually want this. He's your brother." I opened my binder to the first tab and pushed a copy of the acknowledgement form across the table. Both their signatures were at the bottom, dated witnessed. "I don't want anything," I said. My voice was even. I practiced this, not the words exactly, but the register. Calm, flat, not cold, just finished. Dad wrote these terms because he understood exactly how this would go. He knew that without a hard consequence, there would always be another emergency, another exception, another reason why the rules didn't apply this time. He wasn't being cruel. He was being honest. He was being controlling, my aunt snapped. He was protecting the estate, I said, and me. And frankly, if you'd let my brother face consequences 5 years ago, we wouldn't be sitting here. That landed differently than I expected. My brother flinched. My aunt's mouth tightened. You could instruct the solicitor not to enforce it, my aunt said. You have discretion. You could choose to. I don't have discretion on a forfeiture clause, I said. That's not how executor agreements work. I'm legally bound to execute the will as written. If I didn't, I'd be in breach of my own obligations. I looked at her steadily. I don't have the option to let this go, even if I wanted to. I turned to the last tab and slid another sheet across the table. It was the clause itself, the full text, with the relevant sentence underlined. Mr. Osei Bonsu read it aloud, dense and precise and unambiguous. My brother's jaw was working. My aunt had gone very still. Where does the money go? My brother asked finally, his voice smaller than I'd heard it since he was a teenager. Into the charitable remainder designated in the will. Mr. Osei Bonsu said, Your father's named beneficiary was the Hamilton Community Foundation. The funds will be distributed according to the grant schedule he established. My brother stared at the table. So it just disappears. It goes where your father always intended it to go if the trust terms were violated, I said. He told me when he made these arrangements that the money was never really for you. It was an opportunity. An opportunity to prove you could manage something responsibly. He wanted to be wrong about his concerns. He really did. My aunt stood up. For a moment, I thought she was going to say something devastating, something she'd been holding in reserve. Instead, she just looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not anger, not calculation, but something closer to genuine loss. Then she gathered her coat and her bag and walked out of the conference room without speaking. My brother didn't move for a while. When he finally looked at me, his face was stripped of all the easy charm he usually wore like a second jacket. You could have warned me, he said. Dad's solicitor warned you. Dad's will warned you. The acknowledgement form you signed warned you. I paused. I told you 18 months ago when Aunt asked me to release money for your storage unit idea that the account had a forfeiture clause. You were in the room. He looked away. I'm not your enemy, I said, and meant it. I was never the enemy. I was the one holding the line Dad drew because he loved you, and he knew you needed one. He didn't respond to that. He got up eventually and left without his jacket, which he draped over the back of the chair. I didn't call after him. Mr. Osei Bonsu and I sat in the quiet conference room for a moment. He poured us both a glass of water from the carafe on the side table. Your father will be proud, he said. He'd say I could have filed the paperwork faster, I said. The solicitor smiled. Yes, he probably would. The next 2 days were loud in the way that only family can make things loud when they've lost and haven't accepted it yet. My aunt cycled through her responses with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades managing difficult situations by force of personality. First came the calls. I let them go to voicemail. She would fix this. She would find a lawyer. What I'd done was manipulative, a setup, a betrayal of everything my father actually stood for. I listened to each voicemail once and saved them to a folder. My brother sent a series of texts that moved through genuine remorse, bargaining, and then a phase of blame I recognized as the last gasp of someone who's run out of other options. You always looked down on me. You were waiting for this. Dad liked you better, and you used it. I read them carefully and did not reply to any of them. There was nothing productive to say. He needed to be angry at someone, and I had agreed, years before this happened, to stop being the person who absorbs that. The last message from my aunt came 4 days after the meeting. It was brief. She said she'd spoken with a lawyer, who had told her there were no grounds to contest the forfeiture. She said she hoped I understood what I'd done to this family. She said she would need time. I wrote back one sentence: I hope you both take it. My brother went to stay with a friend in Guelph. I heard through a cousin he'd picked up a job at a shipping warehouse, early mornings, physical work. The cousin said he seemed different, quieter. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I just held it. My aunt stopped contacting me after the 6th week. I'd expected relief when the messages stopped. What I actually felt was more complicated, a kind of grief for the version of the family I'd wanted us to be, which had never really existed in the first place. My own life, in their absence, became remarkably orderly. I finished recovering from the surgery without interruption. I went back to work and to my routines. Early mornings, good coffee, the particular satisfaction of problems that have correct solutions. I changed the locks in my condo, which I should have done 8 months earlier when my brother stopped returning my spare key. 3 months after the estate breach, I received a letter from the Hamilton Community Foundation. It was a formal acknowledgement of the incoming funds, along with a brief note about the grant programs they intended to support: affordable housing development, youth employment initiatives, a literacy program for newcomers to the city. My father had cared about all of those things. He'd volunteered with 2 of them before he got sick. I folded the letter and put it in the file I kept for things related to him. Not the estate file, the other one, the personal one, where I kept his handwritten notes and the photograph from his retirement party and a recipe card in his handwriting for the lemon cake he made every Christmas. A month after that, I had coffee with Mr. Osei-Bonsu. He'd asked me to come by to sign off on some final paperwork, and afterward we'd sat in the small waiting area of his office, with cups from the cafe downstairs. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course." "Did you think it would actually happen, when Dad set it up? Did you think someone would trigger the clause?" The solicitor was quiet for a moment, turning his cup in his hands. "I thought it was more likely than not," he said carefully. "Your father thought the same. He wasn't setting a trap. He was being realistic." He paused. "He said something to me when we were drafting the clause. He said the money was never the point. The point was giving you a way out." I looked at my coffee. "He said you'd been carrying them for years. He said he didn't know how to fix that while he was alive without making things worse. But he thought maybe after he could give you the tool to do it yourself." I didn't say anything for a moment. "He used to say I was too patient," I said finally. "He said you were patient enough for 2 people," Mr. Osei-Bonsu said, which was the problem. I drove home in the early evening light, the city moving around me with its usual indifference. The highway was slow past Stony Creek, the kind of slow that gives you nothing to do but think. I thought about my father in his hospital bed reading the clause aloud to make sure I understood it. I thought about my brother standing in the conference room looking at his new shoes. I thought about my aunt walking out without a word, which was somehow the most honest thing she'd done in years. I thought about the word that Mr. Osei-Bonsu had used without using it, a way out. I had spent so long being the responsible one that I'd forgotten the responsible one was also a choice, something I'd agreed to or been assigned to, so gradually that I'd stopped questioning whether I'd ever wanted it. The estate obligation had looked on the surface like more of the same weight. More duty, more management, more holding the line on behalf of people who didn't appreciate lines. But my father had understood something I hadn't, not until that evening on the highway with the sun going flat behind the escarpment. He hadn't given me a burden, he'd given me a deadline. A point at which the carrying would be over, one way or another, because the document would do the work I'd never been able to do myself. He knew I wouldn't say no to a legal obligation. He knew I would follow it exactly. And he knew that if I followed it exactly, I would finally, unavoidably, be free. The traffic opened up past the interchange. I drove the last 20 minutes home in the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. My condo was dark when I got there and warm and entirely mine. I made dinner and ate it at the table I'd bought myself 3 years earlier and had never once eaten at with company, because company had always meant family, and family had always meant something I needed to manage. I ate slowly and thought about nothing in particular. It was the most peaceful meal I could remember. I keep thinking about the label I printed for the binder's spine. Estate file, Section 7 breach. It took me about 4 seconds to type. But the thing it represented, the decision to stop absorbing and start documenting, to stop excusing and start documenting, to stop excusing and start executing, that took years. My father understood something I didn't, not until I was driving home on the highway with the sun going flat behind the escarpment. He didn't leave me a burden. He left me a deadline. And the difference between those two things is everything. What happened to my brother wasn't a punishment. It was a result. He made a choice, not impulsively, not accidentally, but deliberately, with full knowledge of what the account was and what touching it meant. He'd signed a form saying he understood. My aunt had signed one too. The consequences that followed weren't something I invented or imposed. They were already written, already waiting, already the natural endpoint of the path they'd chosen. I just had the integrity to follow the document exactly as it was written, even when that was the hardest version of doing my job. That's the thing about integrity that nobody warns you about. It isn't glamorous. It doesn't feel righteous in the moment. It feels like sitting in a solicitor's conference room watching your brother's face change when he finally understands what he's lost, and not being able to look away, and not being able to fix it, because fixing it would mean betraying the person who trusted you most. My father trusted me with something real, not just money, his final, honest assessment of what his family needed to be free of each other. Honoring that trust, even when it cost me, was the only truly decent thing I could have done. I also think about my brother in Guelph, waking up at 5 in the morning for a warehouse shift. I don't know what's happening inside him, but I know that for the first time in his adult life, he is living inside actual cause and effect. His effort connects to his outcome. There's no one absorbing the gap for him, and as painful as that is, for him and honestly for me too, it is the only condition under which a person can actually grow. You cannot develop genuine resilience when someone keeps removing the resistance. My aunt thought she was protecting him. She was depriving him of the friction that builds character. I spent years being the responsible one and believing that made me strong. What I've come to understand is that it made me useful to people who had no incentive to change. The strength I actually needed wasn't the patience to keep carrying, it was the clarity to put the weight down. My father, in his methodical, unsentimental way, built me a structure that forced that clarity. He gave me the legal obligation I needed because he knew I would never set it down voluntarily. He knew me that well. What I carry now is lighter. A condo that's entirely mine. A table I eat at without managing anyone. The knowledge that when the situation required me to be both honest and brave at the same time, I was. That's not nothing. That's, quietly, everything.